Passionate kiss, billionaire falls, madly in love with the homeless girl he adopted. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories, a prayer for our story family. Dear Lord, thank you for bringing together this beautiful family of storytellers and story lovers from across the world. Bless each person reading this, whether they're joining us from the busy streets of New York, the rolling hills of England, the sunny shores of the Caribbean, the diverse cities of Europe, or the vast landscapes of Australia. May our stories continue to bridge distances and connect hearts. Grant us understanding and kindness in our interactions. When words hurt, give us strength to respond with love. Bless each member of this family with peace, joy, and the warmth of belonging. Thank you for the gift of storytelling that brings us together. Let our time here be filled with imagination, friendship, and respect for one another. Amen. Let me take attendance. Are you present? The Global Family Game. Let's play a fun game to see where our story-loving members are from. I want to know more about you. Here's how we'll play. Tell us which region you're from. Write your heart below. USA. Writer, bald eagle. UK. Writer, lion. West Indies. Writer, Dr. Bird and hummingbird for Jamaica. Scarlet ibis for Trinidad and Tobago. Europe. Writer, various bull for Spain. Gallic rooster for France. Golden eagle for Germany. Australia. Writer, red kangaroo for extra fun. Share what you love most about your country. And while you're here, I'd love to hear, did you enjoy our last story? What kind of stories would you like to hear next? Remember, even when some comments might hurt, I still love each one of you. Your presence here makes this family complete. If you're happy with our stories, just write, "We are satisfied," with a heart. Let's begin our story with all this love in our hearts. Are you ready for today's tale? The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the torrential downpour as David Dawn navigated the treacherous mountain road. Beside him, his wife Elaine clutched the door handle, her knuckles tense against her deep brown skin. In the back seat, 15-year-old Sandra stared out at the dark walls of pine trees, her reflection, warm sienna complexion and tightly coiled curls, appearing momentarily in ghostly flashes as lightning cracked across the sky. "Maybe we should pull over," Elaine suggested, her voice tight with concern, "just until the worst passes." "We're almost through the pass," David replied, leaning forward as if those extra inches might improve his visibility. "Another 20 minutes and we'll be on the main highway." Sandra closed her eyes, trying to block out the storm's fury. The weekend art retreat had been magical. 3 days in a secluded mountain cabin where her parents had helped her prepare her portfolio for the prestigious Westlake Academy of Arts. Her father had beamed with pride when she completed a portrait of her mother, capturing the regal elegance that Elaine had inherited from her Senegalese grandmother. Now, the peaceful creativity of those days felt distant against the violent percussion of rain against metal. "Dad, I think Mom's right," Sandra said, catching her father's warm brown eyes in the rearview mirror. "There's no rush." David Dawn's expression softened as he looked at his daughter's reflection, her features a perfect blend of his broader nose and her mother's high cheekbones. "Always the mediator, just like your mother." He sighed, relenting. "All right, there's a viewpoint ahead. We can wait there until—" The rest of his sentence dissolved into chaos. Later, Sandra would only remember fragments, the blinding high beams appearing suddenly around the curve, the sickening sensation of their car hydroplaning, her mother's scream harmonizing with the screech of tires, and the terrifying moment of suspension before the guardrail gave way. Then, blackness. The antiseptic smell penetrated Sandra's consciousness before she opened her eyes. The rhythmic beeping of hospital machinery created a sterile soundtrack that confirmed what her body already knew. Something was terribly wrong. Pain radiated from her left arm and across her rib cage, but it was nothing compared to the emptiness that had already settled in her chest. "She's awake," a nurse announced, her face swimming into focus above Sandra. "Sandra, can you hear me?" Sandra tried to nod, but even that small movement sent daggers of pain through her skull. "Don't try to move, honey. You've been in an accident. You have a concussion and a broken arm, but you're going to be okay. Going to be okay." The words rang hollow because Sandra already knew the truth. She had felt it in the void that had opened inside her the moment she'd regained consciousness. "My parents," she whispered, the words scraping against her dry throat. The nurse's expression shifted, compassion and regret washing across her features. It was answer enough. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart." The nurse took her uninjured hand. "The doctors did everything they could." The words should have devastated her, but Sandra felt nothing, as if her emotions had been ejected from the car, along with her parents' lives. The numbness was a mercy, one she would later long for when the full weight of grief descended. Hours passed in a blur of doctors, tests, and quiet, meaningless reassurances. As twilight painted the hospital windows purple, Sandra lay staring at the ceiling, disconnected from the body that breathed and blinked mechanically without her conscious participation. The raised voices from the hallway barely registered until she heard her name. "Sandra is my niece, and as her only living relative, I have every right to make decisions regarding her care." The voice was familiar, her father's brother, Uncle Raymond, the man who had always regarded her father's artistic pursuits with thinly veiled contempt. "The social worker is already looking into temporary placement options." Raymond's voice continued, closer now. "My apartment isn't suitable for a teenager, and frankly, I'm not in a position to take on that responsibility." "You mean you're unwilling?" A second voice responded, deep and commanding, yet unfamiliar to Sandra. "There's a significant difference." "And who exactly are you to judge my situation, Mr. Grayson? Some business associate who attended a few dinner parties? You have no standing here." "I promised David—" "Whatever promises you made to my brother died with him on that mountain," Raymond snapped. "Unless you have legal documentation stating otherwise, Sandra will be placed according to the system's determination." The door to Sandra's room swung open, revealing the confrontation. Uncle Raymond stood with his arms crossed defensively across his chest, his thinning hair disheveled and his tie loosened, small disruptions to his usually immaculate appearance. Across from him stood a taller man, broad-shouldered and imposing even in his obvious exhaustion. His steel blue eyes shifted immediately to Sandra, and something in them, recognition, guilt, determination, punctured the numbness that had protected her. "She's awake," the stranger said, his voice softening. He moved past Raymond toward her bedside. "Sandra." He spoke her name as if he knew her, yet Sandra was certain they had never met. She would have remembered those eyes. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Jaden Grayson," he answered, pulling a chair beside her bed. "I was a friend of your father's. We worked together years ago, before he left the corporate world to focus on his art." "Colleague," Raymond corrected sharply, "not friend. David never mentioned you to family." Jaden ignored him, his focus entirely on Sandra. "I came as soon as I heard about the accident. I'm so sorry." There was something in his intensity that both comforted and confused Sandra. The grief in his eyes seemed almost as personal as what she should be feeling herself. "They're gone," she said, testing the words, waiting for them to trigger the emotional collapse that surely awaited her. "Yes," Jaden answered simply, not offering empty platitudes. He reached out as if to touch her hand, but stopped himself. "Sandra, I know this isn't the time to discuss arrangements, but I need you to know you won't be alone in this. Your father, he would want me to make sure you're cared for." Raymond stepped forward. "Mr. Grayson seems to be laboring under some misapprehension about his relationship with your father, Sandra. The fact is, the state will assign a temporary guardian while more permanent arrangements are made." "You mean foster care?" Sandra said flatly. Something dangerous flashed in Jaden's eyes as he stood to face Raymond. "That won't be necessary. I'm offering to become Sandra's guardian." The statement hung in the air, shocking both Sandra and her uncle. "That's preposterous," Raymond sputtered. "You're a single man with no relation to this child. No court would—" "I have resources, a stable home, and a genuine concern for Sandra's welfare," Jaden interrupted. "I've already contacted my attorneys. Given the alternative you're proposing, abandoning your niece to the system, I believe the courts will find my petition compelling." Sandra watched the exchange with detached fascination, as if observing characters in a play rather than men deciding her fate. Outside, the rain that had claimed her parents continued to lash against the windows, providing a somber backdrop to the unfolding drama. "This is highly irregular," Raymond protested, though his indignation seemed to be fading in the face of Jaden's determination. Relief flickered across her uncle's features. He was being offered an escape from an unwanted responsibility. "Sandra," Jaden turned back to her, his expression gentle but serious. "I know you don't know me, but I promise you'll be safe with me. I have a large house with more space than one man needs. You'd have your own wing, your privacy, and I would ensure you continue your education, including your art." "How do you know about my art?" Sandra asked, the first spark of genuine curiosity breaking through her emotional paralysis. A shadow passed across Jaden's face. "Your father was proud of your talent. He mentioned it when we reconnected recently. There was something he wasn't saying, some current beneath his words that Sandra couldn't identify through the fog of medication and grief. But as she looked at this stranger offering sanctuary, she felt the first fragile thread of connection since waking to a world without her parents. "Would I have to change schools?" she asked, surprising herself with the practical question. "Not if you don't want to," Jaden answered, relief evident in his voice. "My home is about 30 minutes from your current school. Transportation wouldn't be an issue." A social worker entered, clipboard in hand, adding another character to the tableau. "Mr. Dawn, Mr. Grayson," she acknowledged with professional neutrality. "I'm Valerie Winters, assigned to Sandra's case." Raymond seized the opportunity. "Ms. Winters, Mr. Grayson here has expressed interest in becoming Sandra's guardian. As her uncle, I want to formally state that I have no objection to this arrangement, provided all proper legal channels are followed." The social worker's eyebrows rose. "That's not typically how these situations proceed, Mr. Dawn. As blood relative, you would generally be unable to provide the stable environment a grieving teenager requires," Raymond finished smoothly. "Mr. Grayson, however, has the resources and apparent willingness. I believe this would be in Sandra's best interest." Valerie Winters approached Sandra's bedside, her expression softening. "Sandra, how do you feel about this? No decisions need to be made immediately." The numbness was fading now, reality beginning to seep through the protective shock. Soon, the pain would follow. The understanding that she would never again hear her mother's laugh or feel her father's hand on her shoulder as he guided her brushstrokes. The thought of facing that tsunami of grief in a stranger's home, or worse, a foster placement, sent the first ripple of fear through her. She looked at Jaden Grayson, trying to understand why this successful businessman would upend his life for the daughter of an old colleague. There were secrets there, mysteries she wasn't equipped to unravel in her current state. But in his eyes, she saw genuine concern, and that was more than her uncle had offered. "I think," Sandra said slowly, finding her voice, "that I'd like to accept Mr. Grayson's offer." The rain outside intensified, as if nature itself was marking the significance of the moment. Sandra didn't know it then, but the decision made in that sterile hospital room would set her life on a course she could never have imagined, one that would eventually lead to both heartbreak and an all-consuming love that defied conventional boundaries. Jaden Grayson's expression remained carefully controlled, but for a brief moment, something like destiny, acknowledged and accepted, flickered in his eyes. "I promise," he said quietly, "you won't regret this choice." Years later, when the full truth of that rainy night emerged, Sandra would remember those words and wonder if he had been trying to convince her or himself. Chapter 2. 7 years later. The charity gala throbbed with quiet wealth, money that didn't need to announce itself but simply existed in the understated elegance of tailored tuxedos and vintage champagne. Sandra Dawn moved through the space with practiced ease, her emerald gown cascading like liquid against her deep brown skin. At 22, she commanded attention, not through volume, but presence, a skill she had refined under Jaden's subtle tutelage. "Your installation is drawing quite a crowd," a voice observed beside her. Sandra turned to find Marcus Chen, the gallery owner who had given her her first solo exhibition 6 months earlier. She followed his gaze to the corner of the ballroom, where her piece, a sculptural painting titled Rainfall, dominated the space. Constructed of layered acrylic on wooden panels, it depicted a highway in the mountains during a storm, the perspective that of someone looking out through a rain-streaked window. Her work blended influences from her Black American experience and her mother's Senegalese heritage, creating pieces that spoke to identity and belonging in ways critics found revelatory. The piece was both haunting and hopeful, the darkness of the scene pierced by distant lights suggesting safety beyond the deluge. "People are drawn to trauma wrapped in beauty," Sandra replied, sipping her champagne. "Makes it digestible." Marcus studied her with the shrewd assessment that had made him successful in the cutthroat art world. "You never explained the inspiration. Some things are too personal to dissect for public consumption." Sandra deflected with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The piece was the first time she had directly addressed the accident in her art, though the imagery of storms had recurred throughout her work for years. Across the room, she caught sight of Jaden in conversation with the hospital board chairman. At 42, Jaden Grayson cut an imposing figure, his broad shoulders impeccably draped in a custom tuxedo, the silver at his temples only enhancing his patrician features. His complexion, several shades lighter than hers, seemed to glow with health and authority under the ballroom's chandeliers. As if sensing her observation, Jaden glanced her way. Their eyes locked briefly before Sandra deliberately turned back to Marcus, ignoring the flicker of awareness that ignited in her veins. 7 years. That's how long she had lived under Jaden's roof. 7 years of evolving from a traumatized, grieving girl into the woman she was now, educated, confident, and increasingly cognizant of the inappropriate nature of her feelings for her guardian. "He's quite proud of you," Marcus noted, following her gaze. "Grayson practically glows when people discuss your work." "Jaden believes in supporting the arts," Sandra replied neutrally. "Jaden, is it? Not Mr. Grayson." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his tone teasing but curious. Sandra felt heat rise in her cheeks, grateful that her complexion concealed the blush. "He's been my guardian since I was 15. Mr. Grayson felt a bit formal after the first few years." Marcus nodded, though something in his expression suggested he was cataloguing the information for future reference. The art world thrived on gossip almost as much as it did on talent. "I should circulate," Sandra said, eager to escape his scrutiny. "The community center needs every donation it can get tonight." Don't forget our meeting next week, Marcus called after her. I have some interesting opportunities to discuss. Sandra nodded acknowledgement as she moved away, threading through clusters of Chicago's elite. The annual Children's Hospital benefit was Jaden's pet project, combining his business acumen with genuine philanthropy. This year, he had incorporated an art auction benefiting both the hospital and the community center, where Sandra taught art therapy to underprivileged children. Her work at the center had begun as a mandatory community service requirement during her first year at the Art Institute of Chicago, but had quickly become her passion. Working with children who used art to express what words couldn't contain resonated deeply with her own experience. Jaden had supported her involvement without question, even donating funds to expand the center's facilities. "There's my favorite artist," came a warm voice as Sandra approached the bar. Zoe Williams, her closest friend since high school and currently a surgical resident at the hospital, stood in a sleek navy gown that complemented her mahogany skin. They had bonded immediately in 10th grade, drawn together as two of the few black students at their elite private school. Favorite resident, looking dangerously close to enjoying her mandatory appearance, Sandra teased, embracing her friend. "I thought you'd be too exhausted to make it. And miss the chance to see you and brooding billionaire doing your careful dance around each other? Never." Zoe's expression turned knowing. "He hasn't taken his eyes off you all evening, by the way." Sandra tensed. "Don't start. Girl, when are you going to acknowledge what's happening between you two?" Zoe sighed, keeping her voice low. "The tension is so thick I could practice my surgical techniques on it." "Nothing is happening," Sandra insisted. "Nothing can happen. He took me in when I had nowhere to go. He put me through school, gave me a home. To even think about him that way would be human," Zoe supplied. "You're both adults now, Sandra. You haven't been his ward for 4 years. Legally, that was true. Sandra had turned 18 while still in her senior year of high school, and Jaden had immediately transferred a substantial trust fund into her name, money from her parents' life insurance that he had invested and grown. He had made it clear that she was welcome to remain in his home, but was free to choose her own path. She had stayed, telling herself it was practical while she completed her education. Now, with her BFA complete and her career gaining traction, the excuses were wearing thin. "It's complicated," Sandra said finally. Zoe's knowing tone spoke volumes. "All I'm saying is, stop punishing yourself for being attracted to an intelligent, successful man who clearly adores you. He doesn't—" "Please," Zoe cut her off. "That man looks at you like you hung the moon and stars specifically for his viewing pleasure." Before Sandra could respond, the subject of their discussion approached. Jaden moved with the confident grace of someone accustomed to navigating both boardrooms and ballrooms with equal authority. "Dr. Williams," he greeted Zoe warmly. "I understand congratulations are in order. Chief Resident is quite an achievement." Zoe beamed. "Thank you, Mr. Grayson, though I suspect having connections to the hospital's most generous benefactor didn't hurt my case." "Your surgical skills did that, not me," Jaden assured her before turning to Sandra, his expression softening imperceptibly. "Your installation is causing quite a stir. The hospital director is particularly moved by it. I believe he's planning to offer you a commission for the new pediatric wing." Sandra felt the familiar warmth that always accompanied his praise. "That's unexpected. Thank you for the opportunity to showcase here." "You earned it on merit," Jaden said firmly. "Your work with the children at the center has been remarkable. The board reviewed the art therapy outcomes data this morning. The improvement in emotional regulation among participants is significant." "The children do the real work," Sandra demurred. "I just provide the space and materials." Jaden's eyes held hers, a hint of exasperation in their blue depths. Always minimizing your contributions, he murmured, echoing a conversation they'd had many times over the years. Zoe glanced between them, a small smile playing at her lips. "Well, I should make my rounds," she said, clearly providing them space. "Sandra, lunch Tuesday." "Absolutely," Sandra confirmed, silently communicating for her friend not to leave. Zoe ignored the plea, squeezing her arm before departing with a meaningful look. Alone with Jaden, Sandra became acutely aware of the subtle scent of his cologne, sandalwood, and something distinctly his own. She took a step back, needing physical distance to maintain emotional boundaries. "The gala is a success," she said, grasping for neutral conversation. "The silent auction has already exceeded last year's total." "Thanks in no small part to your contribution," Jaden replied. "I'm proud of you, Sandra." There it was again, that word. Proud. The appropriate sentiment from a guardian toward his former ward. So why did it always leave her feeling hollow? "You've given me every advantage," she acknowledged. "Most artists don't have the luxury of a stable home and financial security while developing their craft." Something flickered in Jaden's expression. A brief shadow that Sandra had glimpsed occasionally over the years, usually when she expressed gratitude for his support. Before she could analyze it, lightning flashed outside the ballroom's floor-to-ceiling windows, followed by the low rumble of thunder. "Storm's moving in," Jaden noted, his gaze shifting to the darkness beyond the glass. "The Weather Service issued a severe thunderstorm warning. They're predicting power outages across the North Shore." Sandra suppressed a shiver. Though years had passed since the accident, violent storms still triggered an echo of that night's terror. Jaden, attuned to her reactions after their years together, noticed immediately. "Would you like to head home?" he asked quietly. "I can have Richard bring the car around." She hesitated, torn between the professional obligation to remain at an event featuring her work and the childish desire to flee before the storm intensified. "I should stay," she said finally. "There are still several potential buyers I haven't spoken with." "They'll understand," Jaden assured her. "I can make your excuses." His protectiveness, while touching, suddenly grated against her desire to be seen as a fully capable adult in his eyes. "I'm not 15 anymore, Jaden," she said, her tone sharper than intended. "I can handle a thunderstorm." Surprise flickered across his features before his expression smoothed into careful neutrality. "Of course, I didn't mean to suggest otherwise." Regret immediately followed her outburst. "I'm sorry, that was unfair." "No apology necessary." His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're right. Sometimes I forget you're not the girl I brought home from the hospital." The statement hung between them, loaded with unspoken implications. Sandra was acutely aware that they stood at the edge of a conversation neither was prepared to have, acknowledgement of the shifting nature of their relationship as she had matured. Another flash of lightning, closer now, illuminated the garden beyond the windows. The storm was directly overhead, mirroring the emotional turbulence churning inside her. "I should check on the auction," Jaden said, stepping back slightly. "Will you be all right?" "Always," Sandra replied, the word a shield she had learned to deploy when vulnerability threatened. He studied her for a moment longer before nodding and moving away, leaving her with the distinct impression that something important had almost happened. A threshold approached, but not crossed. Sandra watched him navigate the crowd, stopping to speak with various donors, his charm evident in their responsive smiles. The ease with which he commanded respect had been intimidating when she first came to live with him, but over time she had recognized it as a carefully constructed facade, armor built through years in the ruthless world of corporate finance. The Jaden she knew at home was different, quieter, more contemplative, often losing himself in books or music when not working. He had created space for her in his life without imposing himself on hers, maintaining a respectful distance that had evolved naturally as she grew older. Too respectful, perhaps, a treacherous voice whispered in her mind. Thunder crashed directly overhead, startling several guests. The lights flickered ominously, and rain began to lash against the windows with increasing ferocity. Marcus appeared at her elbow. "They're closing the auction early," he informed her. "Half the guests are already calling for their cars." As if to confirm his statement, the ballroom's overhead lights extinguished completely, leaving only the battery-powered safety lights and candles on the tables to illuminate the space. A collective gasp rose from the crowd, followed by nervous laughter. "Ladies and gentlemen," the event coordinator announced through a portable megaphone, "we apologize for the inconvenience. The backup generator should engage momentarily for essential systems, but we recommend concluding the evening's festivities at this time. Hotel staff will assist you in retrieving your belongings and vehicles." The crowd began to disperse with the controlled urgency of people accustomed to having problems solved efficiently. Sandra scanned the room for Jaden, finding him already making his way toward her, phone in hand. "Richard is bringing the car to the front entrance," he said as he reached her. "The storm has knocked out power across much of the North Shore. The roads will be dangerous soon." Sandra nodded, sudden exhaustion washing over her. The evening's emotional undercurrents, combined with the storm's jarring reminder of her past, had drained her reserves. As they moved toward the exit, Sandra cast a final glance at her installation. In the dim emergency lighting, the painted storm seemed to come alive, the boundaries between art and reality blurring in unsettling ways. A premonition shivered through her, the sense that, like the figures in her painting, she stood at the threshold of something transformative. Outside, Richard waited with an umbrella, sheltering them as they hurried to the gleaming black Bentley. Once inside, the car's interior formed a sanctuary against the elements, the sound of rain reduced to a gentle percussion against metal and glass. "Are you all right?" Jaden asked, as Richard navigated carefully out of the hotel's circular drive. Sandra turned from the window to find Jaden watching her with concern. The dim lights of the dashboard cast shadows across his features, emphasizing the strong line of his jaw and the intensity of his gaze. "Just tired," she answered, though it was only partially true. What she couldn't explain was the strange tension coiling inside her, a sense of something inevitable approaching with the storm. "It was a successful evening," Jaden offered, respecting her apparent desire for space. "Your work received significant attention." "Yes," Sandra agreed absently, her mind elsewhere. "The hospital commission would be a wonderful opportunity." They lapsed into silence as Richard guided the car through streets increasingly obscured by sheets of rain. Normally, the drive to Jaden's lakefront estate took 30 minutes from downtown Chicago. Tonight, with the storm raging, the journey stretched longer, the familiar landscape transformed into something alien and foreboding. Sandra found herself drifting toward memories of another stormy drive, another night when rain had changed the course of her life. The parallel was not lost on her, nor, she suspected from his unusually tense posture, on Jaden. As the car finally turned through the ornate iron gates of Grayson Estate, Sandra felt an inexplicable certainty that the night's parallels to the past were not coincidental, but portentous. 7 years ago, a storm had taken her parents and brought Jaden into her life. Tonight's tempest seemed equally determined to alter her course once more. Neither of them could have predicted just how prophetic that feeling would prove to be, or how completely the boundaries between them would dissolve before the storm had passed. Chapter 3. Storm's Confession. The mansion stood dark against the violent sky as Richard pulled the car to a stop beneath the portico. The power outage had reached Grayson Estate, leaving only the battery-operated security lights to pierce the gloom. "I've activated the backup generator, sir," Richard informed them as he opened Sandra's door, rain whipping around the sheltered entrance. "It's only powering essential systems, security, refrigeration, and minimal lighting in the main areas." "Thank you, Richard," Jaden replied, following Sandra into the foyer. You should head home before the roads worsen. The driver hesitated. Are you certain, sir? I can stay if needed. We'll be fine, Jaden assured him, though his gaze flickered to Sandra as if seeking confirmation. She nodded, suddenly conscious of the implications. They would be alone in the darkened house, without the usual buffer of staff. The thought shouldn't have sent electricity coursing through her veins, but it did. Once Richard departed, the mansion felt cavernous in its darkness. Emergency lights cast elongated shadows across marble floors and up the sweeping staircase. The storm's fury seemed magnified by the high ceilings, thunder reverberating through the space like a physical presence. I'll get some candles, Jaden said, his voice oddly tight. The library fireplace is already stocked if you'd like to start a fire. The suggestion made practical sense. The library was the most comfortable room in the house, with plush sofas and sheltered windows. Yet Sandra couldn't help but register the intimacy it implied, the two of them before a fire, illuminated only by candlelight. I'll change first, she replied, needing a moment to collect herself. The backup generator provided just enough light for Sandra to navigate to her suite in the east wing. She slipped out of her emerald gown, hanging it carefully before changing into comfortable loungewear, black leggings and an oversized cashmere sweater that fell off one shoulder. She gathered her curls into a loose bun atop her head, several coils escaping to frame her face. In the bathroom mirror, her reflection seemed different somehow, her eyes wider, lips fuller, as if the darkness had stripped away her careful composure to reveal the woman beneath. She looked both younger and older than her 22 years, vulnerable yet knowing. A particularly violent crack of thunder made her flinch, memory superimposing itself over reality. For just a moment she was 15 again, trapped in twisted metal as rain pounded against shattered glass. The phantom scent of gasoline and wet asphalt filled her nostrils, and her heart hammered against her ribs. Sandra gripped the porcelain sink, forcing herself to breathe deeply. You're not there, she whispered to her reflection. You're here. You're safe. But was she? The question arose unbidden, loaded with meaning beyond physical danger. Her emotional safety felt increasingly precarious in Jaden's presence, her carefully constructed boundaries eroding like shoreline against persistent waves. With one final steadying breath, she made her way to the library. The hallway stretched dark before her, illuminated intermittently by lightning through the windows. She had traversed this path countless times over 7 years, yet tonight it felt like crossing a threshold into unknown territory. The library doors stood partially open, golden light spilling onto the hardwood floor. Jaden had been busy. A fire crackled in the hearth and candles dotted the room's surfaces, casting dancing shadows across leather-bound books and rich wood paneling. He had changed as well, his tuxedo replaced by dark jeans and a grey Henley that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders. He looked up as she entered, something flashing in his eyes before he schooled his expression. "Better?" he asked, gesturing to their casual attire. "Much," Sandra admitted, choosing the armchair across from him rather than the closer space on the sofa. Distance felt necessary tonight. Though I'm not sure anything could make this storm better. As if in response, lightning split the sky outside the windows, followed almost immediately by a thunderclap that seemed to shake the house's foundation. Sandra flinched visibly, her composure fracturing. Jaden leaned forward, concern etching his features. "It still affects you this way," he observed quietly. Not a question, but an acknowledgement. "Not usually," Sandra replied, drawing her legs beneath her. "Not anymore, but tonight." "The anniversary is approaching," Jaden noted, understanding coloring his tone. Sandra nodded. In 2 weeks, it would be 7 years exactly since the accident. 7 years since rain-slicked roads had claimed her parents and delivered her to Jaden's door. "I thought I'd moved past it," she admitted, watching the fire rather than meeting his gaze. My therapist would be disappointed. Healing isn't linear, Jaden replied, surprising her with the insight. Some wounds reopen when we least expect it. Something in his voice, a rawness she rarely heard, drew her eyes to his face. The firelight cast half his features in warm illumination, the other half in shadow, a visual metaphor for the man himself, always partly revealed, partly hidden. You sound like you're speaking from experience, Sandra observed. Jaden's gaze dropped to the crystal tumbler in his hand. He swirled the amber liquid contemplatively before answering. We all carry scars, Sandra. Some are just less visible than others. The unusual openness in his tone emboldened her. You've never told me about yours. A humorless smile touched his lips. You never asked. The simple statement landed like an accusation, though she knew he hadn't meant it that way. In 7 years of sharing a home, how had she never questioned the pain evident in his eyes during unguarded moments? Had she been so consumed by her own grief that she'd failed to recognize his? I'm asking now, she said softly. Jaden studied her for a long moment, seeming to weigh something in his mind. Finally, he set his glass aside and leaned back, his posture both open and defensive. My father was a demanding man, he began, his voice measured. Brilliant in business but cold in personal matters. Nothing was ever enough. Not perfect grades, not athletic achievements, certainly not my interest in art and literature. Sandra listened, transfixed. In all their years together, Jaden had rarely spoken of his childhood. When my mother died, I was 12, he became worse. Drinking, criticism, occasional violence. Jaden's eyes remained fixed on the fire. By 16, I was working multiple jobs, saving to escape. I managed a scholarship to Northwestern, worked my way through business school, and built my company from nothing, determined to be everything he wasn't. You succeeded, Sandra offered quietly. Jaden's gaze shifted to her, something vulnerable in its blue depths. Did I? Sometimes I wonder if ambition was just another form of running, if all my achievements were simply attempts to prove him wrong. The confession hung in the space between them, more intimate than any physical touch. Sandra found herself moving without conscious thought, abandoning her chair to sit beside him on the sofa. You're nothing like him, she said with certainty, though she had never met the man. I've seen you with the children at the center, with your employees, with me. You're kind, Jaden. Patient. Generous. His eyes darkened at her proximity. You see what you want to see, Sandra. I see you, she insisted. Maybe better than you see yourself. Lightning flashed again, casting his features in stark relief. In that moment of illumination, Sandra glimpsed something in his expression that stole her breath. Longing, raw and unguarded. Why did you really take me in? The question emerged unbidden, drawn from some deep place within her that had always wondered. The truth, Jaden, not the explanation you gave the courts. Tension radiated from him, his shoulders rigid beneath the soft fabric of his shirt. For a heartbeat, Sandra thought he might refuse to answer, retreat behind the careful boundaries they had maintained for years. I made a promise, he said finally, his voice barely audible above the storm. To your father. Sandra stilled, confusion replacing momentary hurt. You knew my father better than you've admitted. It wasn't a question, but Jaden nodded, confirmation and confession in one gesture. David and I were more than colleagues. We were friends, close ones before. He hesitated, seeming to search for words. Before complications arose. What complications? Sandra pressed, sensing they approached some crucial truth. Jaden's eyes met hers, torment evident in their depths. I can't tell you that, not yet. Please don't ask me. The plea in his voice was so unlike him, Jaden Grayson, who commanded boardrooms and navigated corporate takeovers with unflappable confidence, that Sandra found herself nodding, accepting the boundary despite her curiosity. "So you took me in because of a promise," she said, processing the revelation. "Out of obligation." "It began that way," Jaden admitted, his gaze never leaving hers. "But Sandra, you must know it became so much more." The intensity in his voice made her heart stutter. What did it become? Lightning flashed again, followed immediately by thunder that rattled the windows. The storm was directly overhead now, nature's percussion scoring their conversation. "Everything," Jaden whispered, the word escaping like a confession. "You became everything." Time seemed suspended between heartbeats as Sandra absorbed his words, their implication igniting something molten in her core. 7 years of carefully maintained distance collapsed in an instant, revealing the truth they had both been circling. "Jaden," she breathed, her voice catching on his name. His hand lifted, hesitating before gentle fingers brushed her cheek, the touch electric against her skin. "I've tried to be what you needed," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "A guardian, a mentor, a friend. I told myself it was enough." "And now?" Sandra asked, leaning almost imperceptibly into his touch. His thumb traced her cheekbone, reverent and tentative. "Now I find myself wanting what I have no right to want." The vulnerability in his admission broke something loose within her, the dam holding back her own desires. Without allowing herself to overthink, Sandra closed the distance between them, her hand coming to rest against his chest, where his heart thundered beneath her palm. "What if I want the same thing?" she whispered. Jaden's breath caught audibly. His eyes searched hers, looking for uncertainty or confusion, and finding only clear conviction. "Sandra," he said, her name both caution and surrender. "There are things you don't know about me, about your parents." "Tell me tomorrow," she interrupted, suddenly certain. "Tonight, just be here with me. No past, no complications, just us, as we are now." The storm crescendoed around them, rain lashing against windows, as if nature itself was cleansing away pretense. In its wild soundtrack, Sandra found courage she hadn't known she possessed. 7 years, Jaden," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. 7 years of living in limbo, trapped between who we were and who we are. I'm not your ward anymore. I'm a woman who knows her own mind, her own heart. His hand trembled slightly against her cheek. "Once we cross this line," he warned, "everything changes." "Maybe everything already has," Sandra countered. "Maybe we're just finally acknowledging it." Lightning illuminated the room in stark white light, thunder following instantaneously. In that flash, Sandra saw Jaden's careful control fracture, desire overwhelming caution in his eyes. His fingers slid into her hair, cradling her head with exquisite gentleness. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his lips inches from hers. "Tell me this isn't what you truly want, and I'll walk away. We'll never speak of it again." Sandra answered not with words but action, closing the final distance between them. Their lips met tentatively at first, the contact sending electricity coursing through her that had nothing to do with the storm. Then hesitation dissolved into certainty as Jaden pulled her closer, deepening the kiss with restrained passion that suggested he had imagined this moment countless times. Her arms encircled his neck as she yielded to sensations she had denied herself for too long. Jaden kissed her as if memorizing her, thoroughly, reverently, his hands remaining respectfully at her waist and in her hair, despite the desire evident in his quickened breathing. When they finally parted, Sandra found herself trembling, overwhelmed by the intensity of feelings unleashed. Jaden's forehead rested against hers, his eyes closed as if in silent prayer or struggle. "I've wanted to do that since your 21st birthday," he confessed, voice raw. When you came downstairs in that red dress, looking like a woman who knew exactly who she was and what she wanted. It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to tell you then." Sandra's fingers traced the strong line of his jaw, marveling at the freedom to touch him this way. "Why didn't you?" "Fear," Jaden admitted, opening his eyes to meet her gaze. "Fear that you would feel obligated or confused. Fear that I was projecting my feelings onto you. Fear of the secrets between us." "No more fear," Sandra whispered, pressing another gentle kiss to his lips. "No more pretending." The storm continued its assault outside, but within the library's walls a different kind of tempest had broken. Years of suppressed emotion finally finding release. As Jaden drew her closer, his arms encircling her with protective strength, Sandra felt as if she had finally found harbor after years adrift. What began as confession had transformed into something more profound, acceptance of truths too powerful to deny any longer. Tomorrow would bring complications, questions about the past that needed answers, but tonight, illuminated by firelight and candlelight, Sandra and Jaden abandoned caution to explore the feelings that had grown between them over 7 years of shared life. And as his lips found hers again, more confident now in her welcome, Sandra knew with unshakable certainty that this storm, unlike the one that had claimed her parents, was not an ending, but a beginning. Chapter 4. First Light. The transition from firelight to bedroom happened in a blur of sensation, Jaden's hand clasping hers as they ascended the darkened staircase, candlelight casting their shadows against rich mahogany walls, the storm providing a primal soundtrack to their journey. Sandra's heart pounded against her ribs, anticipation and certainty warring within her. Jaden paused at the threshold of his bedroom, his expression suddenly vulnerable in the flickering light. "We can stop," he said softly, "at any point. No expectations." Sandra reached up, tracing the strong line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "I've never been more certain of anything," she assured him, rising on tiptoes to press her lips to his. The kiss deepened instantly, unleashing passion that had simmered beneath the surface for years. Jaden's arms encircled her waist, lifting her effortlessly as he carried her into the room. He set her down gently beside the massive 4-poster bed, breaking their kiss to study her face. "You're trembling," he observed, concern creasing his brow. "Not from fear," Sandra assured him, her fingers finding the hem of her sweater. With deliberate slowness, she pulled it over her head, revealing smooth sienna skin in the candlelight. Jaden's breath caught audibly. His gaze traveled over her with reverence, as if memorizing a masterpiece. "Sandra," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. She reached for him, tugging at the soft fabric of his Henley. "Your turn." He complied, revealing a torso sculpted by years of disciplined exercise. Sandra's fingers traced the contours of his chest, exploring territory both familiar. She had seen him shirtless many times by the pool, and thrillingly new in this context. "I've imagined this," she confessed, emboldened by the naked desire in his eyes. "Being with you this way." "How long?" Jaden asked, his voice rough as his hands found her waist, thumbs tracing circles against her skin. "Since I was 19, Sandra admitted. "The night of the hospital fundraiser. You wore a tuxedo, and when you smiled at me across the room, something shifted. I couldn't see you as just my guardian anymore." Lightning illuminated the room, revealing the intensity in Jaden's gaze. 3 years, he murmured. 3 years of wanting what I thought I couldn't have. "We've lost enough time," Sandra whispered, pressing closer to him. Her boldness unleashed something in Jaden. His kiss turned hungry, hands exploring with increasing confidence as clothing fell away between them. Each touch was a revelation, the texture of his skin against hers, the strength in his hands as they mapped her curves, the taste of him on her tongue. When they finally fell to the bed together, Sandra felt as if she had crossed some invisible boundary into a realm where only sensation existed. Jaden worshipped her body with exquisite attention, reading her responses and adjusting accordingly. For all his restraint over the years, he was a passionate lover, attentive, intuitive, and utterly focused on her pleasure. "You're so beautiful," he murmured against her collarbone, trailing kisses down the valley between her breasts. "I've dreamed of this, of you, for so long." Sandra arched beneath him, her body responding to his touch with an intensity that took her breath away. She had been with men before, 2 relationships during college that had ended amicably, but without lasting passion. Nothing had prepared her for this overwhelming connection, this sense of rightness that transcended physical desire. When Jaden finally positioned himself above her, his eyes sought hers in silent question. Sandra answered by pulling him down to her, wrapping her legs around his waist in unmistakable invitation. Their joining was both homecoming and discovery, familiar in its rightness, yet new in its intensity. Jaden moved with deliberate control, his gaze never leaving hers as they established a rhythm that built steadily toward crescendo. Sandra lost herself in the perfection of their connection, her body climbing toward a peak she had never before experienced. When release finally claimed her, it was with Jaden's name on her lips, her fingers digging into the muscles of his back. He followed moments later, his face buried against her neck, body trembling with the force of his own completion. Afterward, they lay tangled together, their breathing gradually slowing as the storm outside began to wane. Jaden's fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder as Sandra rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady cadence of his heartbeat. "What happens now?" she asked softly, voicing the question that hovered between them. Jaden's arms tightened around her. "Whatever we want," he answered. "There's no roadmap for this, Sandra." "The age difference," she began, giving voice to one of many potential complications. 20 years, Jaden acknowledged. Significant, but not insurmountable. "People will talk." "They always do," he replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Does that bother you?" Sandra considered the question honestly. "Not for myself," she decided, "but I don't want your reputation affected because of me." Jaden shifted, propping himself on one elbow to look into her eyes. "My reputation can withstand scrutiny," he said firmly. "The only opinion that matters to me is yours." The sincerity in his voice warmed her from within. "And your secret?" she asked. "The one about my parents?" Tension rippled through him, but he didn't look away. "Soon," he promised. "When the time is right. It's not something to be shared in bed after making love." The phrase "making love" hung in the air between them, its significance not lost on either of them. This hadn't been mere physical release, but something deeper, an emotional connection years in the forming. "I thought I loved you as a guardian," Sandra confessed, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "But this is different, deeper. I didn't understand what I felt until tonight." Vulnerability flickered across Jaden's features. "And now I know it's always been love," she answered simply. "It just changed form as I grew." Jaden brushed a curl from her face. "Your parents spent their honeymoon in Vienna. Your father said it was where they truly became a family, where they found themselves in each other." His expression softened, relief and something more profound filling his eyes. "I fought it," he admitted. "God, how I fought it. Told myself it was inappropriate, that I was projecting, that you deserved someone your own age, without our complicated history." "When did you stop fighting?" "I didn't," Jaden said with a rueful smile. "Not until you kissed me tonight." The honesty in his admission touched her deeply. Sandra leaned forward, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that held promise rather than urgency. When they parted, she nestled against him once more, content in the warmth of his embrace. Outside, the storm had finally moved on, leaving only gentle rain in its wake. The power remained out, but neither of them cared, cocooned as they were in candlelight and newfound intimacy. Sandra was drifting towards sleep when Jaden spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I love you, Sandra Dawn. Have since you were 18 and defending your first gallery, showing with more passion and insight than critics twice your age. I tried not to, but some things can't be denied." The confession, offered in the liminal space between wakefulness and dreams, settled into her heart like a missing piece finally finding home. She pressed a kiss to his chest, directly over his heart. "I love you too," she murmured. "The rest we'll figure out together." As sleep claimed her, Sandra felt a peace she hadn't known since before the rainy night that had claimed her parents. Tomorrow would bring complications, questions to be answered, boundaries to be negotiated, a world to face. But tonight, in Jaden's arms, she had found sanctuary from the storm. What neither of them realized was that the calm after this tempest was merely a prelude to a greater one approaching, one that would test the foundation of trust they had built over 7 years and the love they had finally acknowledged. For some secrets, once revealed, change everything. Chapter 5. Hidden Currents. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through parted curtains, illuminating Sandra's copper-brown curls spread across Jaden's pillow. He watched her sleep, still marveling at the reality of her, in his bed, in his arms. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, yet Jaden's conscience remained clouded with secrets. Sandra stirred, her eyes fluttering open to find him watching her. A smile curved her full lips as memory returned. "Good morning," she murmured, voice husky from sleep. "Good morning." Jaden traced the delicate line of her collarbone, savoring the freedom to touch her this way. "Sleep well? Better than I have in years." She stretched languidly against him. Though sleep wasn't the priority for most of the night, heat flared in Jaden's eyes at the reminder of their passionate explorations. "No regrets in the light of day?" Sandra answered by pulling him down for a kiss that quickly rekindled the fire between them. When they finally parted, breathless, her expression held nothing but certainty. "None," she assured him. "You?" Something flickered across his features. Not regret, but a shadow of the burden he carried. Only that we didn't find our way to each other sooner. Before Sandra could respond, the mansion hummed back to life, lights flickering on, the heating system rumbling awake as power returned. The spell of their storm-induced isolation broken. "Real life intrudes," Sandra observed, sitting up with the sheet clutched to her chest. Suddenly conscious of her nakedness in daylight, she glanced toward the door. "What time does the staff arrive?" "Not until 9, Jaden answered, understanding her concern. "We have time." Yet the question had introduced reality's complications into their sanctuary. Sandra nodded, already reaching for her scattered clothing. "I should get to my room before Mrs. Hudson starts her rounds." Watching her dress, Jaden felt an unexpected pang. "Are we going to hide?" Sandra paused, one arm through her sweater sleeve. "I thought, isn't that what you would prefer, at least until we figure this out?" The hesitation in her voice made him reach for her hand. "I'm not ashamed of loving you, Sandra." "It's not about shame," she replied gently. "It's about giving ourselves space to navigate this change without outside opinions. The staff, my friends, your business associates, they'll all have reactions." Jaden couldn't argue with her logic, though part of him wanted to proclaim their relationship to the world, consequences be damned. But the years had taught him caution, particularly where Sandra was concerned. Discretion, then, he agreed, for now. The following weeks unfolded in a delicate dance of public restraint and private passion. By day, they maintained their established dynamic, Sandra working at the community center, Jaden managing his business empire. But nights transformed the mansion into their private world, where years of suppressed desire found expression. With each day, Sandra found herself sharing more of her artistic vision, her childhood memories. And Jaden revealed his vulnerabilities in return, creating an intimacy beyond physical desire. Their bodies had connected immediately, but now their minds and hearts followed, deepening what had begun as passion into something more profound. In Sandra's studio, amidst canvases and the scent of oil paints, Jaden would find her working late, her focus absolute until his arms encircled her waist. In his study, Sandra would bring him tea, only to find herself drawn onto his lap, business documents forgotten. They stole moments like thieves. A lingering touch at breakfast before the housekeeper entered, heated glances across the dinner table, midnight rendezvous in the library. The secrecy added an undeniable thrill, yet beneath it ran the current of deeper emotions neither had expected. "I never thought it could be like this," Sandra confessed one evening as they lay tangled in his sheets. "So consuming." Jaden's fingers traced the curve of her hip, marveling at the smoothness of her skin against his. "Like what?" "Like I've been living half alive until now." She propped herself on one elbow, studying his face in the lamplight. "It's not just the physical connection, though God knows that's incredible. It's feeling completely seen, completely known." The words pierced Jaden like a blade. Completely known, if only that were true. The weight of his secrets pressed heavier with each passing day, with each deepening of their intimacy. Sandra noticed the shadow cross his face. "What is it?" "Nothing," he lied, pulling her closer. "Just thinking how lucky I am." She accepted the deflection, but Jaden knew his time was running out. The anniversary of her parents' death approached, 7 years exactly since that rainy night. The truth he had buried for her protection now threatened to destroy everything they had built. "You're glowing," Zoe observed over lunch the following week, her shrewd gaze assessing Sandra across the table, "and trying very hard to act normal, which you're terrible at, by the way." Sandra focused on her salad, fighting the blush she could feel rising in her cheeks. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Please," Zoe scoffed. "You've turned down 3 gallery events. You're checking your phone every 5 minutes, and you haven't stopped smiling since you sat down. You're sleeping with someone." Sandra's head snapped up, her eyes darting around the restaurant to ensure no one had overheard. "Zoe!" "Oh my God," her friend breathed, realization dawning. "It's him, isn't it? You and Grayson finally crossed the line." The accuracy of Zoe's assessment left Sandra speechless, confirmation enough. "Well, hallelujah," Zoe declared, raising her water glass in mock toast. "About damn time." "You're not shocked?" Sandra asked, relief warring with surprise. Zoe rolled her eyes. "The only shocking part is how long it took you two to admit what everyone else could see. The way that man looks at you has never been fatherly, Sandra." "We're trying to be discreet," Sandra said, lowering her voice. "It's complicated. Because he was your guardian. Girl, you're 22, successful, independent. Nobody who matters will judge." Sandra wished she could share her friend's certainty. "There's more to it. Something about my parents. Jaden's connected to them somehow, beyond what he's told me." Zoe's expression sobered. "Has he explained?" "He says he will, when the time is right." Sandra traced the rim of her glass, uncertainty clouding her features. "I trust him, Zoe. I just wish he trusted me enough to tell me everything." "Maybe he's protecting you," Zoe suggested gently. "Some truths hurt more than they help." "Or maybe he's protecting himself," Sandra countered, voicing the fear that had begun to grow despite her best efforts. What if whatever he's hiding changes everything? Zoe reached across the table, squeezing her hand. Do you love him? Yes, Sandra answered without hesitation. More than I thought possible. Then whatever it is, you'll face it together. Zoe's confidence was unwavering. Just don't let fear of what might be poison what is. That evening, Sandra found Jaden in his study, focused intently on his laptop screen. She paused in the doorway, taking a moment to admire him. The strong profile, the slight furrow of concentration between his brows, the silver at his temples catching the light. Working late? She asked, announcing her presence. Jaden started, quickly closing the laptop before turning to her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Just finishing up some emails. The hasty movement set off warning bells. Sandra moved into the room, perching on the edge of his desk. Everything okay? Fine, he replied too quickly. How was lunch with Zoe? Enlightening, Sandra answered, studying him. She knows about us. Alarm flickered across his features. You told her? I didn't have to. Apparently we're not as subtle as we thought. Sandra reached for his hand, finding it unusually tense. She's happy for us, by the way. Jaden relaxed slightly, bringing her hand to his lips. At least one person approves. There will be others, Sandra assured him, though uncertainty shadowed her voice. Once we go public... His expression tightened again. About that, perhaps we should wait a bit longer, at least until after the hospital board meeting next month. Politics, you understand. Sandra withdrew her hand, hurt flashing in her eyes. Of course. Wouldn't want to jeopardize business relationships. Sandra, Jaden began, reaching for her. She stood, moving beyond his grasp. What were you really looking at just now, when I came in? The question hung between them, charged with sudden tension. Work documents, Jaden insisted. Nothing important. You're lying, Sandra said softly, the realization more painful than she'd expected. I can see it in your face. Jaden's expression hardened, the mask of the businessman sliding into place. Not everything in my life is your concern, Sandra. Some matters remain private, even between lovers. The coldness in his tone was like a physical blow. Sandra recoiled, arms wrapping around herself protectively. I see, she said, her voice carefully controlled. Well then, I'll leave you to your private matters. She turned to leave, but Jaden caught her wrist, his expression softening into regret. Wait, I'm sorry, that was unfair. Sandra remained stiff in his grasp. Was it? Or was it the first honest assessment of where I stand with you? Lover, yes, but not partner. Not someone you trust completely. Pain flashed across his features. It's not about trust, it's about protection, Sandra finished for him. That's your justification for everything, isn't it? Protecting me. Have you considered that keeping secrets does more harm than the truth ever could? Jaden released her wrist, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Some truths change everything, Sandra. Some truths can't be unheard once spoken. And you get to decide that for me? She challenged, anger rising, like I'm still that 15-year-old girl who needed sheltering. Their standoff was interrupted by Jaden's phone buzzing with an incoming call. He glanced at the screen, tension visibly ratcheting through his body. I need to take this, he said, the apology in his eyes doing little to soothe Sandra's hurt. Of course you do, she replied, stepping back. Your private matters await. As she left the study, Sandra heard him answer, his voice dropping to a tone she'd never heard before, cautious, almost defensive. Yes, I received the files. No, she doesn't know yet. Sandra paused in the hallway, her artist's eye drawn to a sliver of light emerging from beneath Jaden's slightly ajar laptop. Despite her better judgment, she stepped back into the doorway's shadow, watching as he turned away from the desk, phone pressed to his ear. In that unguarded moment, Sandra saw what he had been hiding: photographs on the screen, images from the accident scene 7 years ago, her parents' mangled car at the bottom of the ravine, and in the corner of one photo, unmistakable despite the rain and darkness, Jaden's Bentley parked nearby. Sandra pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling her gasp as the implications crashed over her. Jaden hadn't simply been a friend who appeared after the accident. He had been there, present at the scene on that rainy night. If Jaden was hiding his presence at the accident scene, what other secrets might be buried in his records? What other truths had he calculated she wasn't ready to know? The revelation sent her stumbling backward, mind racing with questions and terrible possibilities. Before Jaden could discover her, Sandra fled to her wing of the mansion, the foundation of trust beneath their passionate affair suddenly crumbling like sand. That night, for the first time since the storm that had brought them together, Sandra locked her bedroom door, and as she paced the floor, wrestling with suspicion and fear, she couldn't help but wonder if the love she had embraced so wholeheartedly was built on a foundation of lies. Chapter 6. The Document. Sandra hadn't slept. Dawn found her sitting at her studio window, watching the sunrise paint Jaden's manicured gardens in gold and amber. The beauty felt like mockery against the turmoil within her. Her phone buzzed. Jaden's 5th message since last night. "Please talk to me. Whatever you think you saw, there's an explanation." The desperation in his texts only confirmed her fears. She hadn't imagined those accident photos or his Bentley at the scene. What she couldn't determine was why he'd hidden his presence that night, or what it meant. Making a decision, Sandra rose and dressed quickly. The mansion staff would be minimal on Sunday morning, giving her the opportunity she needed. Jaden always went for a run at 6, regardless of weather or workload, a habit as predictable as sunrise. His study door was unlocked. Sandra slipped inside, heart hammering against her ribs. She had never invaded his privacy this way, had respected the boundaries of their unusual relationship even as those boundaries blurred. But the image of his car at her parents' accident scene had shattered her trust. The laptop was gone, likely with him or secured elsewhere. Sandra turned her attention to his desk, methodically searching through drawers filled with meticulously organized documents. Nothing seemed relevant until she reached the bottom drawer, locked unlike the others. Frustration coursed through her until she remembered. The antique letter opener Jaden kept on his desk had once been his makeshift lockpick in college, a story he'd shared on a night when whiskey had loosened his usual reserve. She retrieved it, working carefully at the lock until it yielded with a soft click. Inside lay a single manila folder labeled simply Dawn. Sandra's hands trembled as she opened it. The first document was a newspaper clipping about the accident, details she knew by heart. Beneath it, however, lay pages she had never seen, police reports, witness statements, and a confidential investigative file. One page stopped her breath, a statement given by Jaden Grayson the night of the accident, asserting he had been following David Dawn's car due to concerns for his safety after a heated business disagreement earlier that evening. Attached was a transcript of a voice message left on David Dawn's phone an hour before the accident. "David, it's Jaden. This has gone too far. The threats against me I can handle, but bringing my company into it crosses a line. I'm coming up to the cabin tonight. We finish this face-to-face once and for all." Sandra stared at the words, unable to reconcile them with everything she knew, or thought she knew, about her father and Jaden. Threats? A business disagreement severe enough to warrant confrontation on a stormy night? Deeper in the file, she found what appeared to be legal documents dated 3 weeks before the accident. A lawsuit David Dawn had been preparing against Grayson Enterprises, alleging intellectual property theft. According to the draft complaint, Jayden had stolen David's architectural software innovations, using them to secure the government contracts that had catapulted his company to success. Sandra's mind spun with implications. Her father, the gentle artist who had left corporate America to pursue his creative passions, had been planning to destroy Jayden legally, and Jayden had been following him the night of the accident, angry and confrontational. The final document in the folder delivered the most devastating blow: a settlement agreement between Jayden Grayson and Raymond Dawn, dated 2 weeks after Sandra had moved into Jayden's home. In exchange for dropping all potential claims against Grayson Enterprises related to David Dawn's intellectual property, Raymond had received $5 million and agreed to permanent confidentiality regarding all matters related to the accident and subsequent guardianship arrangements. Her uncle had sold silence, and Jayden had bought it. The sound of the study door opening froze Sandra in place. She looked up to find Jayden in the doorway, still in his running clothes, face drained of color as he took in the scene. Sandra behind his desk, the locked drawer open, incriminating documents spread before her. Sandra! Her name emerged strangled from his throat. She rose slowly, clutching the settlement agreement. Were you responsible for their deaths? The question emerged with surprising steadiness, despite the earthquake happening within her. Jayden stepped forward, hand extended. Please, let me explain. Were you responsible? Sandra repeated, voice rising. You were following them in a storm. You were angry. The police questioned you as a suspect before declaring it an accident. Then you paid my uncle millions for his silence and took guardianship of me. Her voice broke on the final words. Was it guilt or strategy to keep me close, to ensure I never discovered the truth? Pain carved deep lines in Jayden's face. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like? Sandra demanded, anger displacing hurt. Explain how you've been lying to me for 7 years. Explain how you could take me into your home, raise me, make love to me, all while hiding your role in my parents' deaths. I didn't cause the accident, Jayden said, his voice rough with emotion. I was following your father because I was worried about him. The message you read, it sounds damning without context, but the reality was more complicated. Then provide the context, Sandra challenged, gripping the desk for support. Jayden moved to the small bar cabinet, pouring himself a whiskey with unsteady hands. He downed it in one swallow before turning back to her. Your father and I were business partners years ago, before you were born, he began. We developed the architectural software together. The night of the accident, we weren't enemies. We were trying to stop one. Sandra's brow furrowed in confusion. The lawsuit was a front, Jayden interrupted. Your father discovered someone was selling our government-contracted security systems to foreign entities. We staged a public falling out to flush out the traitor within the company. That makes no sense, Sandra protested. Why would you need to pretend to fight? Because we believed the leak was coming from someone close to us, Jayden replied, his expression grim. Someone who would only reveal themselves if they thought they could exploit our division. Your father was playing the whistleblower, while I appeared to be the corrupt executive. Sandra shook her head, struggling to process this new narrative. And the settlement with my uncle? Pain flashed across Jayden's features. Raymond knew what we were doing. After David died, he threatened to expose the investigation, which was still ongoing. National security was at stake. The money was to ensure his silence on that matter, not to cover up any role in the accident. Why take me in? Sandra asked, the central question that had haunted her since discovering the photos. Jayden's gaze dropped to the floor. Initially, a promise to your father. He asked me to look after you if anything happened to him and your mother. It was a hypothetical conversation, never meant to be realized. He looked up, eyes suspiciously bright. But then it became about you, Sandra. about the remarkable young woman you were becoming. The explanation was plausible yet incomplete. Sandra sensed the edges of truth but felt certain he was still withholding crucial information. If this is true, why hide it for 7 years? Why not tell me when I was old enough to understand? Jaden moved toward the window, his back to her as he gazed out at the grounds. Because the investigation is still open, he said quietly, and because the person we suspected of treason had a personal connection to your family. Sandra felt ice flood her veins. Who? When Jaden turned back to her, his expression was a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Your Uncle Raymond, Sandra. We believed he was selling the security protocols. Raymond's greed and treason were connected. He needed money to cover gambling debts, which made him vulnerable to foreign interests. The settlement was both hush money and a way to fund his escape if needed. Your father was gathering evidence against his own brother the night he died. The revelation struck like physical force. Sandra sank into Jaden's chair, documents slipping from her numb fingers. That's why Raymond was so quick to give me up, she whispered, pieces clicking into horrible alignment. He never wanted me because I was David's daughter, the man who was about to expose him. We couldn't prove it, Jaden said softly, not conclusively. The investigation stalled after David's death. Raymond was careful, covered his tracks well. And you think he caused the accident? Sandra's voice trembled with the horrifying possibility. I don't know, Jaden admitted, the words clearly costing him. I arrived on scene minutes after it happened. The roads were treacherous. The guardrail was old and compromised. It could have been a tragic accident in dangerous conditions. Or it could have been murder, Sandra finished, nausea rising in her throat. Silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Finally, Sandra rose on unsteady legs. I need time, she said, unable to look at him. Time to process all this. Jaden took a step toward her, then stopped himself. Sandra, please. No, she held up a hand. You've had 7 years to tell me the truth, Jaden. I think I deserve a few days to absorb it. She moved past him toward the door, every step requiring conscious effort. At the threshold, she paused without turning back. Was any of it real? Us, I mean. Or was I always just an obligation, a promise to keep? Sandra, Jaden's voice broke on her name. Everything with us has been real. The only genuine thing in my life. She nodded once, acknowledging his words without accepting them, then walked away. Her mind raced with questions, suspicions, and terrible possibilities. One thought crystallized with growing certainty. She needed to speak with her uncle Raymond. If Jaden had hidden this much for so long, what else might he be concealing? What she didn't know was that Raymond Dawn had just received a very interesting call about his niece. A call that would set in motion events neither Sandra nor Jaden could anticipate. Chapter 7. Broken Trust. Raymond Dawn's downtown apartment reflected his calculated persona, sleek, impersonal, and meticulously maintained. Sandra sat rigidly on his pristine white sofa, the coffee he'd offered untouched on the glass table between them. This is unexpected, Raymond said, studying her with unveiled curiosity. 7 years of radio silence and suddenly my niece remembers I exist. I found the settlement agreement, Sandra replied, watching his reaction carefully. $5 million to keep quiet about what exactly? A flicker of calculation crossed Raymond's features before his expression smoothed into practiced neutrality. I see grace and security isn't what it used to be. Don't deflect. Was it hush money? Payment to look the other way while he took guardianship of me? Raymond sighed, moving to his liquor cabinet. It's complicated, Sandra. Uncomplicate it. He poured himself a scotch, not offering her one. Your father and Jaden were business partners. Their software secured billions in government contracts. When David wanted out to pursue his artistic delusions, there were disagreements about intellectual property. Jaden says you were the one selling security protocols to foreign entities, Sandra countered. That you might have caused the accident. Raymond's laugh held no humor. Of course he'd say that. He studied her, eyes narrowing. You're sleeping with him, aren't you? The perfect culmination of his long game. The sudden shift unsettled Sandra. What are you talking about? Grayson's obsession with your father's life. First his company, then his wife, now his daughter. Raymond's voice hardened with each word. He's using you, Sandra, just like he used Elaine years ago. My mother? Sandra felt ice spreading through her veins. Your mother worked for Grayson Enterprises before meeting David. She and Jaden had an affair. When she chose your father instead, Jaden never forgave him. Raymond's calm facade began slipping, revealing something darker beneath. History repeating itself with his precious ward. You're lying. Sandra stood, needing distance from the subtle menace now emanating from her uncle. Am I? Ask Grayson about Elaine Williams, summer of 2000. Ask why he really followed them that night. Raymond moved closer, his voice dropping. Ask why he's been watching you since you were 18, grooming you. Sandra backed toward the door, instinct warning her of danger as Raymond's controlled demeanor fractured further. His eyes held something she'd never seen before. Desperate calculation. Check your father's old files, he urged, voice suddenly gentle though his eyes remained cold. The cabin in the mountains still stands. The answers you want are there. The drive back to Grayson Estate passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. Sandra entered through the side door, hoping to avoid Jaden until she could process Raymond's claims. But he was waiting in the foyer, tension evident in every line of his body. You went to see him, Jaden said, not a question, but an accusation. I needed his side of the story, Sandra replied, keeping her distance. And did you get it? The carefully crafted lies he's been perfecting for years. Sandra studied the man she'd given her heart to, searching for truth in his expression. He said you and my mother were lovers before she chose my father. That you never forgave him for taking her from you. Jaden's face drained of color. For a moment, he seemed incapable of speech. Is it true? Sandra pressed. It's not that simple, he finally managed, the non-denial confirming her worst fears. My God, Sandra whispered, backing away. All this time, was I just a replacement for her? Some twisted second chance? No! Jaden moved toward her, desperation in his eyes. Sandra, please! Everything makes sense now, she continued, horror dawning. Why you took me in, why you watched me grow up. You've been grooming me from the beginning. That's not true, Jaden protested, reaching for her. I loved your mother once, yes, but what I feel for you is entirely different, entirely real. Sandra evaded his grasp. How can I possibly believe you now? You've lied about everything fundamental to us. You were there the night my parents died. You had motive, and you've been manipulating me ever since. Pain etched deep lines in Jaden's face. I didn't cause the accident. I was following to try and warn them. Raymond had made threats. More accusations without proof. Sandra cut him off. I'm going to the cabin. My father's records are there. Alarm flashed in Jaden's eyes. Sandra, wait. It's not safe. Raymond knows you're investigating now. I can't stay here, she said, finality in her tone. Not with you. Then let me come with you, he pleaded. Or at least take security. Sandra shook her head, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. The two men who should have protected me have been using me as a pawn for 7 years. I think I'm safer alone. She turned toward the stairs, intent on packing essentials. Jaden's voice stopped her. I love you, Sandra. Whatever you believe about the past, that truth hasn't changed. She didn't turn back. Love without trust isn't love at all. It's just another form of control. An hour later, Sandra's car wound up the same mountain road her parents had traveled that fateful night. Rain had begun to fall, a cruel echo she couldn't ignore. Her phone buzzed repeatedly with Jaden's calls, each one ignored. The cabin appeared through the trees, unchanged since that weekend 7 years ago. Time had frozen here while life had continued elsewhere. Sandra unlocked the door with trembling hands, dust motes dancing in the beam of her flashlight. Her father's office remained untouched, papers still scattered across the desk where he'd left them the night they departed. Sandra began methodically searching through folders, journals and notebooks, looking for anything that might confirm either Jaden's or Raymond's version of events. In the bottom drawer of the desk, she found a locked metal box. The key was missing, but the lock yielded to persistent work with a letter opener. Inside lay her father's personal journal and a USB drive labeled simply Insurance. Sandra connected it to her laptop, heart pounding as files populated the screen. One audio file was dated the day before the accident. With shaking fingers, Sandra pressed play, and her father's voice filled the cabin for the first time in 7 years. "Jaden, it's David. I've confirmed it's Raymond. The evidence is all here. Account transfers, meeting logs, everything. He's been selling the protocols for years. I'm bringing everything down tomorrow. Keep Elaine and Sandra out of this. Raymond's made threats I can't ignore. If anything happens to me, the backup is where we discussed. And Jaden, take care of my girl if it comes to that. You're the only one I trust." Sandra sat frozen as the recording ended, her father's final request echoing in the silence of the cabin. Tears streamed down her face as the truth finally crystallized. Jaden had been telling the truth. Her father had trusted him with her life. Fumbling for her phone, Sandra dialed Jaden's number. It rang once before the cabin door opened quietly behind her. She turned to find Raymond watching her from the threshold, his familiar features now unrecognizable with controlled rage as he stared at the evidence spread across the desk. "You found it," he said, his voice unnaturally calm, "just like your father." Sandra rose slowly, maintaining the desk between them, recognizing the predatory calculation in his eyes. "You killed them," she whispered. "You caused the accident." "An unfortunate necessity," Raymond replied with chilling detachment. "Your father always was self-righteous, willing to destroy family for principles." His composure slipped momentarily, revealing the desperation beneath. "Do you know what happens to traitors, Sandra? I couldn't let him ruin everything." "Jaden was right about everything," Sandra realized aloud, inching toward the door. Raymond's smile was terrible in its emptiness. "Jaden Grayson," he sneered. "So devoted to keeping his promise to your father, so devoted to you." He moved suddenly, blocking her escape with surprising speed. Sandra backed away, knocking over a lamp as Raymond's hand closed around her wrist. "You should have stayed out of it," he said, voice cold as he reached into his jacket. "Some secrets are worth killing for, twice in one family." As terror flooded her system, Sandra heard the cabin door crash open. Jaden stood silhouetted in the doorway, rain-soaked and wild-eyed. "Get away from her," he commanded, voice deadly calm despite the fury in his eyes. Raymond's grip tightened painfully as he yanked Sandra against him like a shield. "Perfect timing, Grayson. You can watch history repeat itself." What happened next unfolded in heartbeats. Raymond reached for the gun in his jacket. Jaden lunged forward. Sandra twisted free with desperate strength. The gun discharged with a deafening crack that echoed through the cabin like thunder. As blood bloomed crimson against Raymond's chest, Sandra realized with horror that in their struggle, she had redirected the weapon toward her uncle. His expression shifted from rage to disbelief as he crumpled to the floor. Jaden reached her in an instant, pulling her into his arms as shock overtook her. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance. He had called the authorities before following her to the cabin. "I'm sorry," Sandra whispered against his chest. "I should have trusted you." Jaden held her tightly, his heartbeat strong and steady against her cheek. "I should have told you everything from the beginning. No more secrets, Sandra. Not ever again." As the cabin filled with police and paramedics, Sandra clung to Jaden, the truth finally clear despite the high cost of its revelation. Raymond had destroyed her family once. She wouldn't let his lies destroy what remained of her heart. Chapter 8. The Truth Revealed. Sandra stared at her reflection in the police station bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the woman who looked back. Blood, Raymond's blood, still stained the cuffs of her blouse despite her attempts to wash it away. Outside, Detective Collins waited to continue her statement. She had recounted the events 3 times already, each telling, draining her further. The evidence was clear. Raymond had attempted to kill her, and the gun had discharged during their struggle. Self-defense, they called it. Yet the weight of having ended a life, even one as corrupted as Raymond's, pressed against her chest like stone. When she returned to the interview room, Collins studied her with surprising compassion. "Just a few more questions, Ms. Dawn, then you can go." Sandra nodded, her eyes drawn to the USB drive now sealed in an evidence bag, her father's final testimony against his brother. "The recording confirms Mr. Grayson's account," Collins noted. "Your father was investigating Raymond Dawn's treason. The financial records match intelligence we've gathered over the years about leaked security protocols." 7 years, Sandra whispered. 7 years of believing a lie. Collins closed his notebook. "Sometimes the truth takes time. Your uncle manipulated many people, Ms. Dawn. Not just you." Through the glass partition, Sandra watched Jaden speaking with another detective. Even at a distance, the exhaustion in his posture was evident. "One more question," Collins said, drawing her attention back. "Did you know Mr. Grayson had filed harassment complaints against your uncle 3 times in the past month? Or that he'd hired private security to monitor your movements?" Confusion must have shown on her face, because the detective nodded. "I thought not. It seems Mr. Grayson has been anticipating something like this for some time." The drive back to Grayson Estate passed in weighted silence. Dawn was breaking as Jaden's car wound down familiar roads, the world washed in gentle gold that belied the night's violence. Sandra stared at her father's journal in her lap, its pages filled with evidence of a life she'd only partially known. Photos of her as a child slipped from between its pages. Her father, her mother, and occasionally Jaden at family gatherings. Visual proof of a connection deeper than she'd understood. "You knew Raymond was dangerous," she finally said. "You were watching him." Jaden's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He'd been making threats, becoming erratic. When the investigation reopened last month, he panicked. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I was trying to protect you," Jaden admitted, the familiar excuse hollow now. "I wanted proof before burdening you with suspicions about your only blood relative." Sandra turned to study his profile, seeing both the man she loved and a stranger she was only beginning to truly know. No more protection through ignorance. "I need all the truth, Jaden, about my parents, about you and my mother, about everything." He nodded, accepting her terms. "Where do you want to begin?" "Tell me about my mother," Sandra said quietly, "about your relationship with her." Pain flickered across Jaden's features. "Elaine worked in our design department before meeting David. We dated briefly, 3 months of intensity that burned out quickly." His voice softened. "She was brilliant, passionate about art like you. When she met David, it was immediate. They were meant for each other." "Raymond said you never forgave my father for taking her." Jaden shook his head. "Another lie. I was best man at their wedding, godfather to you when you were born. David was my closest friend. Then why hide that connection all these years? Because the night of the accident, Raymond convinced investigating officers I had motive to cause it. Rejected lover seeking revenge. It was easier to downplay our history than fight those perceptions while trying to gain guardianship of you. The explanation made logical sense, yet left emotional questions unanswered. And us? This connection between us, is it because I remind you of her? Jaden pulled the car to the side of the road, turning to face her fully. Sandra, listen to me. What I feel for you is entirely separate from my brief history with your mother. You are uniquely, completely yourself, and it's you I love, not shadows or memories. Sandra opened her father's journal to a dog-eared page, an entry written 3 months before the accident. Jaden came for dinner again. His bond with Sandra grows stronger. She insists he judge her latest artwork with the same critical eye he uses for his acquisitions. Elaine says, I'm imagining things, but I see how he looks at her sometimes, not inappropriately, but with wonder, as if contemplating the remarkable woman she'll become. He'll be an important presence in her life long after we're gone, I suspect. Her father had seen what she couldn't, the genuine care that had existed long before tragedy thrust them together. This wasn't the observation of a man concerned about inappropriate interest, but one who valued the connection between his friend and his daughter. I believe you, she said simply, closing the journal. But I need time, Jaden. Space to process everything. Pain flickered across his features, but he nodded. Whatever you need. As they pulled into the estate's driveway, Sandra felt the weight of the past 24 hours pressing down. Raymond's death, her father's recordings, the truth about her parents' relationship with Jaden. It was too much to reconcile in the aftermath of trauma. I'm thinking of going away for a while, she said as they reached the house. Somewhere to clear my head. Of course, Jaden replied, though she could see the effort it took for him to support her decision. Anywhere specific in mind. Sandra thought of the photos she'd found in her father's journal, her parents standing before a Baroque cathedral, young and in love. Vienna, she said, the idea crystallizing. My parents honeymooned there. I think I need to connect with them, with who they really were. Jaden nodded, understanding in his eyes. Take all the time you need. As they entered the house together, the physical distance between them mirrored the emotional space Sandra knew she needed. Not to escape what they had built, but to ensure whatever came next would be founded on truth rather than reaction. Jaden respected her silence as they climbed the stairs. At her door, he paused. Sandra, he said softly, whatever you decide about us, please know that David was your father in every way that matters. He made you who you are. The simple truth in his words, offered without expectation, touched something deep within her. She nodded once before slipping into her room, closing the door on the past to begin the journey toward whatever future awaited. Chapter 9. Vienna Echoes. Twilight embraced Vienna as Sandra waited on the Albertina Museum steps, watching pedestrians flow through the historic square. Her heart quickened when she spotted him, Jaden striding purposefully through the crowd, travel-worn but handsome in a charcoal sweater and dark jeans. His pace slowed as he approached, uncertainty in his eyes despite the eagerness in his step. They stood facing each other, separated by mere feet that felt like an ocean after their time apart. Hi, Sandra said simply, her voice catching. Hi, Jaden echoed, drinking in the sight of her. You look beautiful. Sandra had dressed with care, a burgundy dress that complemented her deep brown skin, her natural curls framing her face. You look tired, she observed, noting the shadows beneath his eyes. I haven't slept well since you left, he admitted without pretense. The honesty refreshed her after so many years of calculated truths. Sandra extended her hand, an offering and invitation. Jayden took it, the contact sending electricity through her veins, despite everything they'd endured. "Walk with me," she said, leading him away from the museum. "There's something I need to show you." They walked in comfortable silence through Vienna's elegant streets, fingers intertwined. Sandra guided them to a small cafe tucked on a cobblestone side street, its faded sign reading, "Café Mozart." "This is it," she said, stopping before the entrance. "Where my parents met." Understanding dawned in Jayden's eyes. "Their honeymoon," Sandra nodded. "After you told me they came to Vienna, I started researching. Found their names in an old guest book here. Apparently my father proposed in this cafe." Inside, the cafe remained frozen in time. Crystal chandeliers, red velvet banquettes, and the soft notes of a piano in the corner. The hostess seated them at a small table by the window, where evening light filtered through lace curtains. "I've been visiting their Vienna," Sandra explained as they settled. "Walking paths they walked, seeing sights they saw. It's helped me understand them as people, not just parents." Jayden listened intently, his gaze never leaving her face. "David loved this city," he offered, said it was where art and intellect coexisted in perfect harmony. "Like him and my mother," Sandra mused, "the artist and the engineer." She paused, gathering courage. "Tell me something about them I don't know. Something real." Jayden's expression softened with memory. "Your father couldn't cook to save his life, but every Sunday he made these terrible pancakes your mother pretended to enjoy. They'd dance in the kitchen to Nina Simone while you napped." His smile turned wistful. They were imperfectly perfect together. Tears stung Sandra's eyes at this glimpse of ordinary moments lost. "I've been angry that you kept their history from me, but I understand now. You've carried them for me all these years, preserving their memory until I was ready." "I should have shared them with you sooner," Jayden acknowledged. "Fear made me cautious." "Fear of what?" "Of losing you," he admitted. "First to the pain of their loss, then to the complications of our shared past, and finally to the truth of my feelings." Sandra reached across the table, taking his hand. "I'm still here." The simple statement hung between them, laden with forgiveness and possibility. Jayden turned her hand in his, tracing the lines of her palm with gentle fingers. "Where do we go from here?" he asked, vulnerability naked in his eyes. "Forward," Sandra replied with certainty. "Not as guardian and ward, not shadowed by the past, but as equals choosing each other with clear eyes." Relief washed across Jayden's features. "I can work with forward." After dinner they wandered Vienna's illuminated streets, relearning each other through conversation unhindered by secrets. Near midnight, they found themselves on the Albertina Platz again, the city quieter now, as Sandra led them to a bench overlooking the square. "My parents sat here," she explained, settling beside him. "Their initials are carved underneath, ED plus DD." Jayden's arm encircled her shoulders, drawing her close against the night's chill. "Your father was terrified of defacing public property. Your mother must have been very persuasive." Sandra laughed, the sound unburdened for the first time in weeks. "Tell me more about them," she requested. "Everything you remember." Under starlight, Jayden shared stories, her parents' arguments and reconciliations, her father's artistic frustrations, her mother's brilliant solutions to engineering problems. Each anecdote filled gaps in Sandra's memory, transforming fading images into vibrant, flawed, beautiful humans. "Thank you," she whispered when he finally fell silent, "for keeping them alive, for me." Jayden cupped her cheek gently. "They would be incredibly proud of the woman you've become, Sandra. Strong, talented, compassionate. You embody the best of both of them." The compliment touched her deeply. Sandra leaned into his touch, allowing herself to fully acknowledge what her heart had known, despite doubt and fear. She loved this man, complicated history and all. "Kiss me," she requested softly. Jaden hesitated, searching her eyes for certainty, before lowering his mouth to hers. The kiss was tender, unhurried, not the passionate claiming of their storm-fueled beginning, but a careful promise for the future. When they parted, Sandra rested her forehead against his. "Stay with me tonight," she whispered. "Not for passion, but presence. I've missed you." His arms tightened around her. "I've missed you too, more than I have words to express." Hand in hand, they walked to Sandra's hotel, the night enfolding them in quiet intimacy. In her room, they undressed in comfortable silence, sliding beneath cool sheets to hold each other close. Sandra rested her head on Jaden's chest, his heartbeat a steady rhythm beneath her ear. "I love you," she murmured into the darkness. "Not despite our complicated past, but with full acknowledgement of it." Jaden's kiss pressed against her hair. "I love you, Sandra Dawn. Always have, always will." As she drifted towards sleep in his arms, Sandra felt the echoes of the past settling into proper perspective, not forgotten, but integrated into the foundation of their future. Tomorrow would bring new beginnings, but tonight, in a city that had witnessed her parents' love story, Sandra embraced her own. Neither noticed the envelope that had been slipped beneath her hotel room door while they slept. A final message from Raymond Dawn, arranged to be delivered in the event of his death, containing the one truth Jaden had never revealed. Chapter 10. Before dawn, morning light filtered through gauzy curtains as Sandra stretched contentedly, her hand reaching across sheets still warm from Jaden's presence. A note on his pillow explained his absence, gone for coffee and pastries, back soon with proper Viennese breakfast. Ja-to-do. Rising, Sandra wrapped herself in the hotel robe, savoring the simple joy of waking in a world unburdened by secrets. As she crossed to the bathroom, her foot nudged something near the door, a cream-colored envelope addressed in familiar handwriting, her uncle's handwriting. Sandra froze, staring at it as if it might detonate. With reluctant fingers she picked it up, noting the Vienna postmark dated weeks before. Raymond had arranged this delivery well in advance of his death. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a DNA test result. "Sandra, if you're reading this, I'm likely dead, and you've chosen to believe whatever fiction Grayson has crafted. There's one truth he'll never voluntarily share. The DNA test enclosed confirms what I've suspected since you were born. Your mother's brief affair with Jaden had consequences. He's not just your guardian or lover. He's your biological father." Raymond. The paper slipped from Sandra's fingers as conflicting emotions warred within her. Revulsion rose first. She had slept with her own father. Then disbelief. Surely this was another of Raymond's manipulations. Yet the official-looking test results stared up at her from the floor, clinical terminology confirming paternity with 99.98% certainty. Beneath the initial horror, a deeper response surfaced, not disgust, but grief. Grief for what this meant for the father who had raised her, for the relationship she had built with Jaden, for her own identity suddenly fractured. The door to the suite opened. "Sandra, I've brought breakfast," Jaden called. She couldn't respond, paralyzed by the collision of emotions. Footsteps approached the bathroom, then stopped abruptly. She knew without looking that he'd seen the letter. "Sandra!" Her name emerged, strangled from his throat. When she finally looked up, Jaden stood frozen in the doorway, his face ashen. The bakery bag had fallen from his grasp, spilling pastries across the carpet. "Is it true?" Sandra asked, her voice unnaturally calm despite the storm within. The flicker of guilt across Jaden's features answered before his words could. "I never knew for certain," he said hoarsely. "Your mother and I, it was over months before she announced her pregnancy." "But you suspected," Sandra pressed, rising from the floor with unnatural steadiness. "You took guardianship of a child you believed might be your daughter." "I asked Elaine once, when you were 2, Jaden admitted, his voice hollow. "She said you were David's daughter in every way that mattered, and I needed to respect their marriage. And later, when I came to live with you—" Each word emerged precise, controlled, despite the chaos in her mind. "After the accident, I had a DNA test performed," Jaden confessed, pain etched in every line of his face. "I needed to know—" "If you were sleeping with your own daughter," Sandra finished, her voice finally cracking as anger broke through the shock. "No!" Jaden's anguish was palpable. "I never saw you that way, Sandra. Never. David raised you. You were his in every way that matters." "Except biology," Sandra countered, bile rising again. "How could you not tell me this before we became intimate? How could you make that choice for me?" Jaden took a step toward her, desperation in his eyes. "I convinced myself it didn't matter, that genetics were irrelevant to what we'd become to each other." "Genetics are irrelevant to incest?" The word hung between them, ugly and accusatory. "It wasn't like that," Jaden insisted, his voice breaking. "What we have isn't—" "I don't know what we have anymore," Sandra interrupted, grabbing clothes from her suitcase. "I don't know who I am." "You're Sandra Dawn," Jaden said firmly. "The woman I love, the daughter David raised. Your identity hasn't changed." But it had. Sandra felt it shifting beneath her feet like sand. The certainty of who she was, suddenly questionable. Yet amid the revulsion and betrayal surged another emotion she hadn't expected. Grief for what she was losing. Despite everything, her love for Jaden remained, twisted now with confusion and anger, but undeniably present. "The test could be falsified," Jaden suggested desperately. "Raymond would do anything to separate us." "Then let's find out," Sandra challenged, pulling a hair from her head and extending it. "Take it. Have it tested against yours. Prove Raymond wrong." Jaden stared at the strand between her fingers, conflict raging in his eyes. His hesitation told her everything. "You already know," Sandra whispered, her voice breaking as certainty settled. "You've always known." "Sandra, please," Jaden begged, reaching for her. "Let me explain." She recoiled from his touch. "I need to get out of here." "Where will you go?" Genuine concern colored his voice, despite everything. "I don't know," she admitted, shoving belongings into her bag. "Away from you. Away from everything I thought I knew." She moved toward the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. "Was any of it real?" she asked, needing this final answer. "Any of it at all?" Jaden looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "Every moment, every word, every promise. The only lie was omission, Sandra, not intention." Something in his broken expression reached past her anger to the love that still lived beneath her sense of betrayal. "I need time," she said, her voice softening despite herself. "Don't follow me." As she stepped into the hallway, Jaden's voice reached her one last time. "I'll respect your wishes," he promised. "But Sandra, before you make final judgments, there's one more place you should visit in Vienna. Karlskirche, St. Charles Church. Your mother prayed there every morning during their honeymoon. It's where she made her most difficult decisions." Sandra hesitated, torn between rejecting anything he offered and grasping this connection to her mother. Without acknowledging him, she continued walking, though she tucked the suggestion away in her heart. The grand dome of Karlskirche rose majestically against the blue Vienna sky. Sandra sat in a rear pew, surrounded by centuries of faith and supplication. The beauty surrounding her stood in stark contrast to the ugly confusion within. "Sometimes beauty exists alongside pain," came a gentle voice beside her. Sandra turned to find an elderly black woman settling onto the pew, her silver-streaked hair elegantly wrapped in a colorful scarf. "I suppose," Sandra replied, restraint in her voice despite her desire for solitude. "You have her eyes," the woman observed unexpectedly. Elaine's eyes, questioning everything, seeing beneath surfaces. Sandra stiffened. "You knew my mother?" The woman nodded. "Many years ago, when she came here with your father, I was the church caretaker then." Suspicion flared. "Did Jaden send you?" "Child, I haven't seen Jaden Grayson since he was a young man visiting Vienna with your parents after their wedding." The woman's directness held no deception. "I recognize you from the photos Elaine showed me. She was so proud of her little girl." The coincidence seemed impossible, yet the woman's knowledge was too specific to dismiss. "My mother came here often." Every morning during their stay, wrestling with the decision about the past and future. The woman studied Sandra with knowing eyes. "As you are now." Sandra found herself confiding in this stranger who had known her mother. "I've discovered something that changes everything I thought I knew about myself, about my relationships." "Biology is powerful," the woman said, surprising Sandra with her insight. "But it isn't destiny." Elaine understood that. "What do you mean? Your mother came here confused about what defines family, blood or choice." The woman's gaze was gentle but direct. "She chose to believe that love determines parenthood more than genetics." The implication hung in the air between them. Sandra felt her breath catch. "You knew about Jaden." "I knew Elaine faced a difficult choice and found peace in making it based on love rather than obligation." The woman rose, placing a warm hand on Sandra's shoulder. "Whatever truth you're struggling with, ask yourself, does it negate everything that came before, or simply add complexity to a story still being written?" As she walked away, Sandra called after her, "What did my mother decide?" The woman turned, sunlight through stained glass illuminating her gentle smile. "That David was your father in every way that mattered, and that the future should be built on love rather than secrets. Perhaps it's time to have your own DNA tested, child, not just to confirm or deny, but to truly move forward." Left alone in the cathedral's peaceful silence, Sandra felt something shift within her. Not forgiveness, not yet, but willingness to seek truth before making irrevocable decisions. For the first time since reading Raymond's letter, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that their love, complicated as it was, might still be worth fighting for. Outside the church, she reached for her phone and typed a simple message to Jaden. "Meet me on the Stephansplatz at sunset. One conversation, complete honesty, then I decide." His response came immediately. "I'll be there. Thank you." As Sandra walked Vienna's sunlit streets, she prepared herself for the most difficult conversation of her life, one that would determine whether what she and Jaden had built could survive the ultimate test of truth. Chapter 11. Reckoning. Stephansplatz buzzed with tourists as sunset painted Vienna's Gothic cathedral in amber and gold. Sandra spotted Jaden immediately, standing apart from the crowd, tension evident in his posture. He wore the same clothes from mourning, his usual immaculate appearance disheveled by hours of uncertainty. "Thank you for coming," he said when she approached, his voice rough from emotion. Sandra nodded curtly. "Not here. Too public." They walked in silence to a small parklet nearby, finding an isolated bench beneath flowering linden trees. Distance stretched between them, despite their physical proximity. the easy intimacy of yesterday shattered by morning's revelations. "Complete honesty," Sandra demanded without preamble. "No more calculated truths or protective omissions." Jaden nodded, his gaze steady on hers. "Where should I begin? Did you know my mother was pregnant before she married my father?" "Yes." The simple admission hung in the air. "She told me when she ended our relationship. And you suspected the child was yours." "I did," Jaden acknowledged, "but Elaine was certain, or claimed to be certain, that the timing meant David was the father." Sandra forced herself to ask the question that had haunted her all day. "When did you decide to find out for sure?" Pain flickered across Jaden's features. "After the accident. When I became your guardian, I had a DNA test performed while you were still in the hospital." His voice faltered. "I needed to know if I was protecting my friend's daughter or my own. And when the results confirmed I was yours." Sandra's voice cracked despite her determination to remain composed. "I nearly told you then," Jaden admitted, "but you were 15, traumatized, grieving the only parents you'd ever known. How could I add that burden to your shoulders? Tell you the man you'd called father wasn't biologically yours." The explanation, however reasonable, didn't diminish Sandra's sense of betrayal. "That justifies the initial secrecy, perhaps. Not 7 years of lies, not becoming my lover." Jaden flinched, as if struck. "I never saw you as my daughter, Sandra. Your parents, David and Elaine, raised you. I was your guardian, then your friend, and eventually something more. The biological connection was a fact I compartmentalized, buried beneath the man I'd become in your life." "You should have told me before we became intimate," Sandra insisted, anger flaring. "I deserve to know who I was sleeping with." "You're right," Jaden conceded, anguish evident in his eyes. "I convinced myself the truth would only hurt you, that biology was irrelevant to what we'd become to each other. I was wrong to make that choice for you." His unqualified admission surprised her. Sandra had expected justifications, not acceptance of culpability. "Why tell me about your relationship with my mother but hide the possibility you were my biological father?" "Cowardice," Jaden admitted simply. "I feared losing you completely. The former might complicate our relationship, the latter might destroy it." His voice broke. "As it apparently has." The raw honesty in his response reached past Sandra's defensive anger. "I don't know what this means for us," she confessed, vulnerability creeping into her tone. "Everything feels tainted now, confused." "Do you want scientific confirmation?" Jaden asked quietly. "We can have an independent test performed." Sandra shook her head. Raymond wouldn't have sent false results. He knew this revelation would devastate us both. They sat in silence as twilight descended, the city's lights blinking on around them. Sandra studied the man beside her. The strong profile she had traced with reverent fingers, the eyes that had gazed at her with such tenderness. Biology had not created those moments, nor had it forged the connection that had grown between them over 7 years. "I've been thinking about identity," Sandra said finally, "about what makes us who we are. David Dawn raised me, shaped my values, encouraged my art. He was my father in every way that matters." "He was," Jaden agreed softly. "A wonderful father who loved you completely." "And you were never a father to me," Sandra continued, working through her thoughts aloud. "A guardian, yes, a mentor, eventually a friend and partner, but never a father figure." "Never," Jaden confirmed, a flicker of hope lighting his eyes. "I've loved you in many ways over the years, Sandra, but paternal love was never among them." Sandra faced him directly. "I need time to process this, to understand who I am with this new knowledge and what it means for us." "I understand," Jaden said, resignation and acceptance in his tone. "Take whatever time you need. I'll respect your decision, whatever it may be. The simple dignity in his response touched something deep within her. Despite everything, Jaden was offering her freedom without manipulation or pressure, a final act of love regardless of the outcome. "I'd like to stay in Vienna a while longer," Sandra said. "Alone." Jaden nodded, pain evident in the tight line of his mouth. "Of course, the hotel suite is paid through the month. Use it as long as you wish." He rose to leave, hesitating before adding, "Whatever you decide about us, Sandra, please know that David was your true father. Biology created a connection between us, but he created the remarkable woman you've become." As he turned to go, Sandra caught his hand. "Jaden." He looked back, vulnerability naked in his eyes. "I don't know if we can move past this," she said honestly, "but I'm willing to try to understand. That's all I can offer right now." Relief washed across his features. "That's more than I deserve," he said softly. "Thank you." Sandra watched him walk away, his shoulders straight despite the burden he carried. The biological revelation had shaken her foundation, yet beneath the shock and sense of betrayal remained an undeniable truth. She loved him still. Not as the perfect man she had imagined, but as the flawed, complex human he truly was. Whether that love could survive this final test remained to be seen. But as stars appeared above Vienna's elegant skyline, Sandra found herself remembering the wise woman's words in Karlskirche. Ask yourself, does it negate everything that came before? Or simply add complexity to a story still being written? For the first time since morning, Sandra allowed herself to consider the possibility of the latter, a story complex and unconventional, but perhaps still worth writing. Chapter 12. Eternal Dawn. 3 months transformed Vienna from spring to summer, its imperial grandeur softened by lush greenery and cafe tables spilling onto sun-drenched sidewalks. Sandra stood on the Danube footbridge at dawn, watching light break across the river's surface. The familiar weight of a sketchpad pressed against her side, filled now with images of the city that had become her sanctuary. "I thought I'd find you here," came a voice behind her. She turned, heart quickening despite herself. Jaden stood several paces away, respectful of boundaries yet unmistakably present. 3 months had changed him, a new leanness to his frame, silver more prominent at his temples, vulnerability evident in his stance. "You came back," Sandra said simply. "You asked me to," Jaden replied. "Your message said today, this bridge, at dawn." Sandra nodded, turning back to the water. "I wasn't sure you would. I would cross oceans for the chance to speak with you, Sandra." The quiet certainty in his voice held no manipulation, only truth. She gestured for him to join her at the railing. As he moved beside her, Sandra noted the careful distance he maintained, close enough for conversation, far enough to respect her space. The consideration touched her. "How have you been?" he asked. "Finding myself," Sandra answered honestly, "redefining who I am with this new knowledge, making peace with the past." "And have you found yourself?" Sandra studied the water below, golden in early light. "I've discovered I'm still Sandra Dawn. My identity wasn't created by biology but by choices, my parents', yours, and ultimately my own." Relief flickered across Jaden's features. "I'm glad. These past months have been clarifying," Sandra continued. "I've been researching, speaking with therapists who specialize in complex family relationships. And their perspective, that genetic connection alone doesn't define inappropriate relationships, that the context of our history matters." She finally met his gaze directly. "That I need to decide what matters most to me, biology or the genuine love that grew between us." Hope kindled in Jaden's eyes. "And what matters most to you, Sandra?" She reached into her pocket, withdrawing an envelope. "Before I answer that, there's something you should see." Jaden accepted it with visible trepidation, carefully opening the sealed document. His expression shifted from confusion to shock as he read its contents. "I don't understand," he said finally, looking up. "This says that you're not my biological father," Sandra finished for him. "Raymond lied, manipulated the results. One final attempt to destroy what we had." Jaden stared at the DNA test results. Official, verified, conclusive. "How did you—" "I had the test performed privately, using samples from both of us," Sandra explained. "I needed certainty before making any decisions about our future." "So David was—" "My father," Sandra confirmed, "biologically and in every other way." The revelation seemed to physically transform Jaden, years of guilt lifting from his shoulders. Yet behind his obvious relief, Sandra detected something unexpected, a flicker of conflict. "Would it have mattered?" she asked suddenly, insight striking. "If the results had confirmed Raymond's claim, would you still be standing here now?" Jaden considered the question with the honesty they'd promised each other. "It would have complicated things immeasurably," he acknowledged. "But yes, Sandra, I would still be here, asking if we could find our way back to each other." The answer, so simply given yet profound in its implication, dissolved the last of Sandra's reservations. "I spent these months preparing for either outcome," she admitted, questioning whether love could transcend even this complication. "I discovered something surprising. It can—" She moved closer, eliminating the careful distance between them. "Raymond failed. His final lie couldn't destroy what we've built, just as his earlier deceptions couldn't. Our connection isn't defined by shared DNA, but by shared history, chosen trust and love that survived the ultimate test." Jaden's hand trembled slightly as he reached for hers. "What are you saying, Sandra?" "That I choose us," she answered, intertwining her fingers with his, "with clear eyes and full knowledge of our complicated path. Nothing hidden, nothing assumed." Dawn broke fully across the water as Jaden drew her into his arms, his embrace conveying what words could not: gratitude, relief, and love that had endured separation and uncertainty. When their lips met, the kiss held the familiar passion that had always sparked between them, now heightened by hard-won honesty. "I have something for you," Jaden said when they finally parted. He withdrew a small velvet box from his pocket. "I've carried this since leaving Vienna 3 months ago. Not as presumption, but as hope." Inside lay a ring unlike any Sandra had expected. Not a traditional diamond, but an intricately designed band of platinum and gold, twisted together in a complex pattern that caught the morning light. "It's beautiful," she whispered, understanding the symbolism immediately. 2 separate metals strengthened by their union. "Created to endure," Jaden added softly. "Like us." Sandra extended her hand, allowing him to slip the ring onto her finger. "Not an ending," she mused, admiring how it caught the light, "but a new beginning." As the city awakened around them, they remained on the bridge where truth had finally set them free. Not from each other, but from the shadows that had too long dictated their choices. The journey had been complicated, painful, and ultimately transformative, revealing a love powerful enough to withstand both secrecy and brutal honesty. "What now?" Jaden asked, his arm around her waist as they watched boats begin their morning journeys along the Danube. Sandra smiled, leaning into his embrace. "Now we write our own story," she said simply, "together." The dawn light bathed them in golden promise as they stood at the threshold of a future neither could have imagined that stormy night 7 years ago. A future built not on obligation or secrets, but on truth freely chosen and love that had transcended every boundary placed before it. Dawn had broken, midnight whispers finally giving way to daylight's honest voice.